A 14-year-old boy was running. Behind him was a convenience store owner. Within moments, a single gunshot would ring out across a Columbus, South Carolina neighborhood. When the chaos ended, a teenager named Cyrus Belton lay dying in the street. The man who fired the shot was Rick Chow, a local business owner, a husband, a father, and according to prosecutors, a man who chased a child over a misunderstanding involving 4 bottles of water. The story didn't end there, because investigators discovered something else. Cyrus was carrying a loaded 9mm handgun, and suddenly what appeared to be a straightforward murder case became something far more complicated. Prosecutors would argue that Cyrus never threatened anyone, and defense would argue that Rick Chow saved his son's life. One side claimed that the teenager was fleeing. The other claimed he turned and pointed a gun. And at the center of it all was a question no witness could answer with absolute certainty. What happened during those final seconds? Tonight's case shocked an entire community, but like every crime, there was a reason. Welcome to the Voice of Reason. Who was Rick Chow? Before the shooting, before the arrest, before the protest and national headlines, there was Rick Chow. And at the time of trial, Chow was a 61-year-old. He was a businessman, a husband, a father, and the owner and operator of a Shell convenience store located on Park Lane Road in Columbia, South Carolina. Born in Hong Kong, Chow later immigrated to the United States and became an American citizen. To many customers, he was simply the man behind the counter, the owner who worked long hours, the familiar face of a neighborhood business, the kind of person people passed every day without giving a second thought. But behind the ordinary public image was someone who took security seriously, perhaps too seriously, according to prosecutors. Evidence introduced during the trial revealed that Chow had previously discharged a firearm during separate incidents involving suspected shoplifters. Those incidents never resulted in charges, no convictions, no arrests, no criminal findings. But they became relevant because prosecutors wanted the jurors to see a pattern of someone willing to use a firearm during a confrontation involving suspected theft. The defense disagreed. They argued the prior incidents proved nothing about what happened on May 28th, 2023. Still, the information painted a picture. The store owner who had experienced theft before, businessman frustrated by repeated criminal activity, and the man who carried a firearm legally. Because on the night of the shooting, Rick Chow possessed a valid concealed weapons permit. The fact that later became important because no one disputed that Chow legally possessed the gun. The dispute centered entirely on whether it was legally justified in being used. Quite frankly, to understand the case, jurors first had to understand the victim. Cyrus Belton was 14 years old. 14. At an age where most teenagers are thinking about school and friends, sports, and summer vacation, their future. According to family members, Cyrus was loved. He was a son. He was a student. A young man whose entire life still stretched out before him. The future would end on a Sunday evening in May. Yet before the shooting occurred, one fact would become central to the case. Cyrus was carrying a loaded 9mm semi-automatic handgun. The firearm reportedly included a laser sight attachment. Nobody disputed its existence. Nobody disputed that it was loaded. And nobody disputed that it was recovered near Cyrus after the shooting. What jurors would spend weeks debating was how the firearm was used. The prosecution argued it was never used to threaten anyone. And the defense argued that it was the single most important fact in the entire case. Because if Cyrus pointed the weapon, the shooting might be justified. If he didn't, the shooting might be murder. Everything would eventually come down to that distinction. The tragedy began with something so small that many people struggled to comprehend how it could lead to death. 4 bottles of water. On the evening of May 28th, 2023, Cyrus entered the Shell convenience store owned by Rick Chow. According to prosecutors, Cyrus picked up 4 bottles of water while inside the store. Then he put them back. Investigators would later determine that no theft had occurred. No merchandise had been stolen. No crime had been committed. But at the time, members of the Chow family believed something very different. They believed Cyrus had shoplifted, and that belief changed everything. What should have been an ordinary evening inside a convenience store suddenly became a confrontation. Words were exchanged, accusations were made, and tempers began to rise. And within minutes, events were spiraling towards a tragedy nobody could stop. Because once Cyrus left the store, Rick Chow and his son, Andy, followed. And what happened next would become the center of one of South Carolina's most controversial murders. Most shoplifting incidents end quickly. Suspects leave, and store owner calls police. A report is filed. Lives move on. This one didn't. According to investigators, Rick Chow and Andy Chow began pursuing Cyrus on foot after he left the store. The chase continued, farther and farther from the Shell station, eventually covering approximately 130 yards. The distance became one of the prosecution's strongest arguments, because every step further and further away from the store raised a question: why continue? Why pursue? Why not stop? But the defense would later argue that those questions missed the point, because according to their version of the event, the critical moments hadn't happened yet. The gun hadn't entered the story. Not yet. And when it did, everything changed for Rick Chow, for Cyrus Belton, for 2 families, and for an entire community that would spend years debating what happened during the final seconds before a single gunshot echoed through Columbia. Every homicide case eventually narrows down to a single moment, a moment measured not in minutes, not in hours, but in seconds. For the jury in the Rick Chow trial, everything came down to understanding those final seconds. According to investigators, the pursuit had already moved approximately 130 yards from the Shell convenience store. The original accusation would involve 4 bottles of water, but investigators would later conclude that no theft had actually occurred. Yet now the situation had escalated far beyond a misunderstanding. Teenager was running. Rick Chow and his son Andy were pursuing him. Then something happened. The problem was that not everyone agreed on what that something was. The prosecution claimed Cyrus was simply fleeing. The defense claimed Cyrus suddenly became a deadly threat. And in the space between those 2 versions of events, a single gunshot was fired. Rick Chow pulled the trigger of his .45 caliber Glock pistol. The bullet struck 14-year-old Cyrus Belton in the back. The teenager collapsed. Within moments, the chase was over. The confrontation was over, and a routine Sunday evening had become a homicide investigation. Emergency responders rushed to the scene. Witnesses gathered. Police began arriving, but the injury was catastrophic. Despite efforts to save him, Cyrus Belton died from the gunshot wound. The manner of death was classified by the medical examiner as a homicide. The medical classification including death at the hands of another person, not a legal finding of guilt. For investigators, the immediate question was simple. Why was a 14-year-old dead? For prosecutors, the answers would become murder. For the defense, the answers would become self-defense through the defense of another. As investigators processed the scene, they recovered one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire case, a loaded 9mm semi-automatic handgun. The firearm belonged to Cyrus Belton. It reportedly had a laser sight attached, and the existence would become a centerpiece of the defense's strategy. The prosecution never denied the gun existed. The defense never denied Cyrus was shot. Instead, both sides focused on a much narrower question. How was the gun used? The prosecution argued it wasn't. They maintained that Cyrus never pointed a weapon at anybody, and the defense argued the exact opposite. According to their theory, Cyrus pointed the firearm directly at Andy Chow, and Rick Chow fired to save his son. The disagreement would become the defining issue of the trial, because the gun itself wasn't disputed, only the actions surrounding it. One of the prosecutor's most important witnesses was Lori Ann Carlson. Carlson was an eyewitness. She had no family connection to either side, no apparent personal stake in the outcome, and her testimony would become some of the most emotionally powerful evidence presented to the jury. According to Carlson, Cyrus appeared frightened, running, trying to get away. She told jurors he looked frightened and scared. She also testified he looked like he needed help. According to Carlson, she never saw a firearm in Cyrus's hands. She never observed him threatening anyone, and she never saw him point a gun. For prosecutors, her testimony reinforced their central argument that Cyrus was fleeing, not attacking, running, not threatening, escaping, not pursuing. If jurors believed Cyrus's testimony, it significantly strengthened the state's case. But the defense wasn't finished, because another witness would introduce one of the biggest challenges to the defense's theory. Deputy Derek English was among the first law enforcement officers to arrive on scene. His testimony would become one of the most discussed portions of the trial because English testified about something that wasn't said. During the initial interviews following the shooting, English stated that neither Rick Chow nor Andy Chow told him that Cyrus had pointed a gun. That omission mattered a lot because the entire defense rested on the idea that Cyrus had pointed the firearm at Andy. If that truly happened, prosecution asked, why wasn't it immediately reported? Why wouldn't that be the very first thing that someone said? The defense argued that people experiencing traumatic events do not always provide perfect accounts, that memories develop, details emerge, stress affects communication. But prosecutors believe that omission spoke volumes. To them, it suggested that the gun pointing claim came later, after time had passed and after people had a chance to think. The jury would eventually have to decide how much weight to give that testimony and whether it created doubt about the defense's version of the events. Sometimes the most powerful evidence isn't physical evidence, it's human behavior. As after the shooting, witnesses testified that Rick Chow attempted CPR on Cyrus Belton. The defense highlighted This fact repeatedly. Their argument was straightforward. Someone acting out of hatred or malice doesn't usually attempt to save the person they just shot. According to defense attorneys, Chow's actions immediately after the shooting demonstrated concern, not cruelty, but panic, not malice. A father who believed he had made a necessary decision and then desperately tried to save a life. The prosecution viewed the matter differently. They argued that the post-shooting action could not erase what happened before the trigger was pulled. And ultimately, the jury's responsibility wasn't to determine whether Rick Chow felt bad afterwards. It was to determine whether the shooting itself was justified. Approximately 15 hours after the shooting, investigators arrested Rick Chow and charged him with murder. The arrest immediately divided the community. For Cyrus' family, it represented accountability, the beginning of a search for justice. For Rick Chow supporters, it represented something very different, a man being prosecuted for protecting his son. As the case moved towards trial, both sides became more entrenched. One side saw a 14-year-old boy shot in the back after being wrongly accused of theft. The other saw an armed individual creating a deadly threat. And as months turned into years, the debate only intensified because everyone agreed on the outcome. A teenager was dead. The real battle was over why. And soon, that question would be placed before a jury. The shooting happened in May of 2023. The trial would not begin until years later. In that time between those events, both sides prepared for a legal battle that would become one of the most closely watched criminal cases in South Carolina. Prosecutors believed that they had a straightforward case. The 14-year-old had been chased. The teenager had been shot in the back. And investigators concluded that no theft had actually occurred. The defense saw something completely different. They believed that the case was about a father making a split-second decision to save his son. And before the trial even began, they attempted to have the charges dismissed under South Carolina's stand your ground protections. The request failed. Judge Scott Sprouse denied immunity. That meant the case would proceed to a jury. Ultimately, 12 citizens would decide what happened during those final seconds before the gunshot. Leading the prosecution was Fifth Circuit Solicitor Byron Gibson. His job was clear: convince jurors that Rick Chow committed murder. Throughout the trial, prosecutors repeatedly returned to a central theme. The shooting should never have happened. According to the state, Cyrus did not steal water. He was falsely accused. He attempted to leave. He was pursued. He was shot in the back, and the shooting was unjustified. The prosecution emphasized that investigators determined no theft occurred. The entire confrontation began because of a mistaken belief. But perhaps the most powerful argument came: the bullet entered Cyrus's back. For prosecutors, that fact was difficult to ignore. A shot to the back suggested a person moving away from danger, not toward it, running, not attacking, fleeing, not threatening. And again and again, prosecutors reminded jurors of witness testimony stating that Cyrus appeared scared and desperate to get away. Then came one of the most memorable statements of the entire trial. Byron Gibson stood before the jury and declared his life was worth less than 4 bottles of water. The statement echoed throughout the courtroom and eventually through news coverages across the country because it captured the prosecution's position in a single sentence. A child was dead, and according to the state, It all began over a misunderstanding involving water that had never been stolen. The defense team, led by veteran attorney Jack Swirling, approached the case from a completely different direction. They argued the prosecution was asking jurors to ignore the most important fact of the entire case: the gun. No one disputed that Cyrus possessed a loaded 9mm handgun. No one disputed it was recovered after the shooting. And no one disputed that Rick Chow knew a firearm was involved. According to defense, that fact changed everything, because their case wasn't about water. It wasn't about shoplifting. And it wasn't about pursuit. It was about a father trying to save his son. And defense attorneys argued that during the chase, Cyrus pointed the handgun at Andy Chow. If that happened, they argued, then Rick Chow had every legal right to use deadly force, not to protect himself, to protect Andy. The legal principle is known as defense of others. In essence, the law allows a person to use force to defend another individual if they reasonably believe that the person faces imminent death or serious bodily injury. According to defense, that's exactly what happened. Rick Chow saw a threat. He believed his son was in danger and reacted. Perhaps the most memorable defense argument came when Swirling focused on the firearm itself. He argued, and I quote, "If he didn't have that weapon, the implications were clear. Without the gun, there would have been no shooting, no homicide case, no trial, and perhaps no tragedy at all." At the center of the defense case was Andy Chow. His testimony was critical because, according to the defense, Andy was the person facing danger. He was the person who allegedly saw the firearm pointed at him. Public reporting did not provide every detail of Andy's testimony, but his account formed the foundation of the defense strategy. According to defense, Andy believed Cyrus pointed the weapon. Andy believed he was in danger, and Rick Chow acted to protect him. Without Andy's accounts, the defense of others' argument became much more difficult. With it, reasonable doubt would become possible. That is why his testimony carried enormous weight, because if jurors believe Andy, the shooting might be justified, and if they didn't, the prosecution's case became much stronger. As testimony concluded, the case narrowed to a single legal question: not whether the shooting was tragic. Everyone agreed it was. Not whether Cyrus died. Everyone agreed he did. The question was whether prosecutors had proven murder beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's an important distinction. The defense did not need to prove Rick Chow was innocent. The defense did not need to prove Cyrus pointed the gun. The defense only needed to create reasonable doubt about the prosecution's version of events. And there were several areas where doubt existed. Witnesses disagree. The most crucial moment happened quickly. No video clearly captured exactly what occurred during the final seconds, and the handgun undeniably existed. Jurors would now have to decide whether those facts created enough uncertainty to prevent a conviction. The future of Rick Chow rested entirely in their hands. 12 jurors, one decision, and a verdict that would determine how this case would be remembered forever. When closing arguments ended, the attorneys sat down. The witnesses were gone. The evidence had been processed. And for the first time since the shooting, neither side controlled what happened next. The case now belonged to the jury. 12 citizens entered the deliberation room carrying the weight of a teenager's death and man's future on their shoulders. Inside that room, they reviewed everything: surveillance footage, the testimony, the firearm evidence, the statements from witnesses, the arguments from prosecutors and defense attorneys, and most importantly, the legal instructions provided by the court. The jurors were not tasked to decide whether the shooting was tragic. Everyone agreed it was. They were tasked to decide whether Cyrus deserved to die. No one argued that he did. Their responsibility was far narrower. Had the state of South Carolina proven beyond a reasonable doubt that Rick Chow committed murder? Or did enough uncertainty remain to prevent a conviction? The answer to that question would determine the outcome of the most controversial criminal trials in South Carolina history. And on June 1st, 2026, the jury had reached its decision. The courtroom filled with tension. Families sat waiting. Attorneys prepared themselves. Reporters gathered. Then the verdict was read. Not guilty. Rick Chow was acquitted of murder. For his family, the moment brought relief. Years of uncertainty had ended. The threat of spending the rest of his life behind bars was gone. For Cyrus' family, the verdict brought a very different emotion. Heartbreak, frustration, and the realization that the criminal case had ended without a conviction. The jury had spoken. The state had failed to prove murder beyond a reasonable doubt. But as often happens in controversial cases, the verdict did not end the debate. It intensified it. One of the most misunderstood concepts in criminal law is the meaning of a not guilty verdict. Many people hear not guilty and assume it means the jury determined that the defendant did nothing wrong. That isn't what the verdict means. A not guilty verdict means something very specific. The prosecution failed to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Nothing more. Nothing less. The jury did not declare that Rick Chow was a hero. The jury did not declare that every decision he made was correct. The jury did not establish that the defense version of events were true. Instead, the jurors determined that the state failed to eliminate reasonable doubt. That distinction is crucial because one major factual question remains unresolved. Did Cyrus Belton point the handgun at Andy Chow before the shot was fired? The prosecution said no. The defense said yes. And the jurors never had to debate which side was correct. They only had to decide whether prosecutors proved their version beyond a reasonable doubt. Ultimately, they concluded that the state had not met that burden. For the Belton family, the verdict did not bring closure. Their son was still gone. A 14-year-old, a child, a future cut short, and no verdict could change that. The family members and supporters expressed disappointment following the acquittal. Many continued to believe the shooting was unjustified. Many continued to believe that accountability had not been achieved. And while the criminal case had ended, the legal fight itself was not necessarily over. The family publicly indicated plans to pursue civil remedies. Unlike criminal trials, civil lawsuits operate under a lower burden of proof. The question is not guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Instead, the focus becomes whether liability can be established by a preponderance of the evidence. In other words, more likely than not, the difference means that acquittal in criminal court does not prevent future civil litigations. Whether such litigations ultimately succeed remains to be seen, but it ensures that the story may not be completely finished. Some cases become famous because of shocking crimes. Others become famous because of controversial verdicts. The Rick Chow case became significant because it forces people to confront difficult questions without easy answers. How should citizens respond when they suspect a crime? How far should someone go to pursue a suspected offender? And when does a perceived threat justify deadly force? How to, or do over, how reliable are eyewitness accounts during moments of chaos? And perhaps most importantly, how should juries evaluate cases when the most critical moments are disputed and only partially supported by physical evidence? These questions extend far beyond Columbia, South Carolina. They affect self-defense law, defense of others, and citizen intervention. And the way courts evaluate reasonable doubt. The case has become a study of how jurors process uncertainty, because it's one of those things that at the core, the trial wasn't about proving exactly what happened. It was about proving what could be proven and acknowledging what could not. After years of investigation and a lengthy criminal trial, several facts were established beyond dispute. There were proven facts. Rick Chow shot Cyrus Belton. Cyrus died from a gunshot wound. Cyrus possessed a loaded 9mm handgun. The handgun was recovered at the scene. Investigators concluded no theft of water occurred. A jury acquitted Rick Chow of murder. And there were the allegations by the prosecution. Cyrus never threatened anyone. The shooting was an unjustified pursuit killing. The use of deadly force was unnecessary. The allegations by the defense were that Cyrus pointed the handgun at Andy Chow. Rick Chow believed his son faced imminent deadly danger, and the shooting was lawful defense of another person. And then there were the unresolved questions. The single most important unanswered question still remains. Did Cyrus point the firearm at Andy Chow before the shot was fired? The question was never definitely resolved by physical evidence, and it remains the central point of the disagreement in this case. At its heart, this case began with a misunderstanding, a belief that a theft had occurred, a pursuit that continued farther than anyone expected, a firearm, a split-second decision, and a teenager who never made it home. The jury answered the legal question, but many of the emotional questions remain. A family lost a son. Another family spent years defending a father accused of murder. A community divided over justice, and a nation reminded once again how quickly ordinary moments can become irreversible tragedies. When people view Rick Chow as a murderer who escaped conviction or a father who saved his son depends largely on how they answer the same question the jury struggled with. What happened in those final seconds? And after everything investigators uncovered, one thing remained painfully clear. Every crime has a reason. And this has been the Voice of Reason. I am Reason. Another tragic case. And it's, quite frankly, my whole thing is still the fact that why chase somebody for 130 yards? That makes absolutely no sense to me. You are at the point now in which you are 2 or 3 blocks away. And here's something else that you have to take into consideration. Rick Chow was under the presupposition that Cyrus had stolen from him. Now, in my opinion, Cyrus is already in a lost-lost situation, because to prove that you're not stealing from somebody while you have a loaded gun on you is going to be always interesting. Leave your thoughts in the comments, you guys. Again, this is the voice of reason. I am Reason. Thanks for hanging out with me this evening. I've got another good one coming for you next week. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and good night.